Okay, let's talk some more polyvagal theory and how we can use it to re-regulate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the emotions in complex trauma in particular. So, I've been reading Porges' book. Really interesting. He's a genius. Wow. Kind of dense. So, hopefully I can give you some good stuff. Vagal tone and physiological regulation of emotions. These are important components. So he talks about how the vagus nerve that we've always kind of associated with parasympathetic, meaning rest and digest, but also social engagement. That's a component of parasympathetic and having good vagal tone. The reason those are linked is because of the way the wiring goes. You have the vagus nerve that innervates, many of your organs, and you have both afferent and efferent components to the wandering, branching vagus. So when we talk about afferent versus efferent in the nervous system, what we mean is there are some neurons that move things, meaning it's a motor neuron. That would be efferent. The mnemonic is effort, meaning, right, motor. This is how I remembered it in medical school. And then afferent is sensory. So you're sensing, and that information is flowing back up to the brain, right? The information to move a motor neuron is flowing from the brain down. Move here or do this. And you have that with vagus. You have information flowing bidirectionally with the vagus nerve to various organs. Why is this important? Well, because of the places that overlap with the wiring, you really have a lot of the right brain structures that are associated with emotion that tie in really to sympathetic stimulation. So the sinoatrial node in the heart, meaning the pacemaker cells of the heart that are triggered to speed up the heart rate when you're trying to run from the bear, those are paired to a lot of the emotional centers in the brain, which is interesting. And so some of the research that Porges and company have done has looked at emotional dysregulation and how that changes. So it's pretty reliable that you have part of vagus is like a brake on the system. And so you have what's called vagal tone, right? And good vagal tone helps once sympathetic is kind of, the timing for sympathetic is finished, then it puts it back into parasympathetic. That's good vagal tone. One of the markers for that with this crossover bit is they looked at heart rate variability. So heart rate variability is the measure really of how the heart fluctuates, because the heart rate is always fluctuating, but in an adaptive type way to being mobilized or to stressors or things like that. So let's say you need to run from the bear. Well, you do need your heart to speed up and pump, but you also, after you've escaped the bear, you want it to go back to baseline to be able to kind of quickly re-regulate. And what we see with HPA axis dysfunction and dysregulation, along with complex trauma, is that you stop having the ability to with cortisol, right? Cortisol spikes, but then it can't return to normal, and so then you have extra cortisol hanging around, and then at some point you have you go from having a lot of cortisol to having no cortisol or minimal cortisol, and so now you can't, you don't mobilize as well, which is, you need both. You need to be able to mobilize, but you also need to be able to shut it down. And so heart rate variability is according to Porges and company, a good measure of if you are doing that adjustment, that transition seamlessly back to, between states, which is ideally what we want. So they basically did research on patients diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Now, I'm not going to get into I'm not going to open the can of worms of all the problems that there are with, number one, the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder and how it's a catch-all category, and how it's also, like when a practitioner it has issues with a patient or they're non-compliant, if they're probably borderline, right? I mean, I've watched this happen before quite a bit. And so it ends up being, it's a catch-all kind of category a lot of times. And there are issues with borderline personality disorder in the fact that when you have complex trauma, it looks very much like borderline personality disorder. And so it's possible that a lot of people that have been labeled this way actually just have complex trauma, CPTSD. But anyways, that aside, what they found, they looked at basically a stimulus that was emotional, visual. I want to say it was like violent imagery or something along these lines, and then measured. They took a baseline, but also measured changes in heart rate, like heart rate variability stuff, and then how quickly somebody could return back to baseline. And then they compared people with the borderline personality label to control. And what they found was heart rate variability actually was lower in the group that had borderline personality disorder or trauma, right? Lots of trauma decreased that heart rate variability. And the group that had, the control group actually had better heart rate variability. And so they've looked at this as a marker for how seamlessly someone is able, like their vagal tone. Are they able to re-regulate? Both on an emotional level, but also on the physiological level. And this is the crossover, right? We've got polyvagal theory helps us understand this crossover point, which I love, but also the implications in terms of how to treat emotional dysregulation, HPA axis dysregulation, complex trauma, etc., right? From a physical side. So now you can get at it if you start to target ways to change heart rate variability. And you're asking, what can we do for that, Jen? I knew you were going to ask that. So specifically, cardio. I know, you wanted me to say weight training. I wanted me to say weight training too. But cardiovascular exercise does, especially over the long term, increase heart rate variability. Because what happens is, right, when you're running on the treadmill, your heart has to speed up in order to get the blood to all the skeletal muscles. And then what happens when you stop exercising is then your heart has to return to something like baseline. But what ends up happening is the stress of running, of cardiovascular work, ends up keeping the heart rate elevated for a while. I mean, it is varying, but it goes up, and it kind of stays up if you're not cardiovascularly very fit. And then your body your heart and blood vessels have to compensate by growing stronger. And therefore, eventually in time, what will happen is the muscle of the heart actually gets stronger. And so it has greater capacity to pump more blood with each stroke. And then even what you'll see, and so this is a good measure for your own cardio, just a real basic way to measure your heart rate variability is to run. And as soon as you stop running, take your pulse, and then a minute later, take your pulse again. And really, it should drop from when you, like at the end of exercise, you know, it'll be whatever, elevated, of course. And then within a minute, it should drop at least, I think it's 20 beats it's supposed to drop. And that's a sign that your heart is able to compensate and has that variability piece, which is what we want, right? We want it to be able to, in the face of stressors and the need to mobilize, we want it to be able to do that, but we also want it to be able to return to baseline quickly and restabilize, like, because you're no longer putting those demands on it. But an inability to do that suggests poor cardiac health, and interestingly enough, poor emotional health, right? Because they're linked. And so we can actually get at helping re-regulate the emotions by re-regulating the cardiovascular system. I love this stuff. So that's exciting. And then other things that are going to increase heart rate variability, I've already talked about some of them on this channel in passing. So intermittent fasting increases heart rate variability. Alcohol decreases heart rate variability. So that's one reason that alcohol has ill effects on health in general. So, and changing diet, you know, there are lots of ways to address increasing heart rate variability. Prolonged exhalation type exercises with the respiration, such as you would have with certain kinds of chanting, such as you would have with certain kinds of breathing, meditation. All these things increase heart rate variability. So, pretty freaking awesome. Thanks for tuning in. This was going to be a short video, and apparently I'm unable to do that anymore. Adios.